Welcome to DRC episode 9, and for the first time since episode 2, today we're discussing a piece of music from a video game. And while today's piece holds less nostalgia for me than that last one did, it certainly threw up a few surprises. So let's get into this. So despite being massively into the anime and collecting the cards quite heavily in the late 90s, I never actually played a Pokémon game until about 2010, early 2010. I was staying at someone's flat and they had to go to bed early. I had work in a couple of hours and they chucked me a Game Boy Advance to kind of entertain me and a copy of Pokemon Crystal. And then from there I was hooked. And while Crystal was where I first dipped my toes in, I have played other generations since, and I've got to say that the third generation is probably my favourite. There's a good balance of charming design, explorative gameplay, and diversifying the play-in style a bit by introducing sort of Pokemon contests, the secret bases, and a lot more ways to get around on your Pokemon. I feel that Gen 3 and Gen 4 are probably peak Pokemon in my view, and that's why those like dorkly videos you get where they're kind of ripping on Pokemon or something are usually animated in that style. And as charming as the visuals are, the sound design and the music in these games is just as iconic. My earliest experience of this generation of Pokemon was when my wife was playing sort of Ruby or Sapphire, and there were definitely moments in the music that piqued my interest. I couldn't tell you specifically which ones they are now, but the music that played while she was collecting Ash on Route 113 is such a vibe. Today, however, I'm talking about the track Slateport City, which is something I came across much later on when I played the game myself. Now, I'll be completely honest here, I thought I appreciated this track before. I had no idea just how deep it was, but we'll get into that, trust me. Nearly every Pokemon game since the first one has been composed by Junichi Masuda, and in the second and third generation of games, he was then joined by Morokazu Aoki and Go Ichinose. And of these, it's Go Ichinose who has composed this particular track. It should be said that it was rarely adequate to only be a composer when working on old game consoles, particularly the Game Boy and Game Boy Advance, as due to hardware limitations, the sounds of the music would have to be carefully considered to fit around other sounds that were playing. This is important to the breakdown of the track, and I'll be coming back to this point as well very shortly. Now, as the name suggests, Slateport City provides a soundtrack to a city location within the game. In a role-playing game like this, a good town or city should have its own sense of character and should be enjoyable enough for the player to want to spend a considerable amount of time there. Depending on their playstyle, a player may spend anywhere between 5 minutes and a couple of hours in a given location like this, which means that the role of the music in a town or city is to immediately establish that sense of character, its essence, and then maintain a level of interest and energy as the player runs around and collects items, talks to people, and basically sorts themselves out before moving on. When you think about it, it's a very particular brief with 3 distinct criteria. Whatever the vibe, the tone has to be instantaneous. It can't tell too much of the story of whatever's going to happen next, and it's going to be heard for a long period of time, potentially. By definition, these last 2 criteria really work against each other, but in the hands of a skilled composer, it can be met with some really interesting results. And that is precisely what has happened here. You see, I've been on a bit of a journey with this particular track over the last couple of months. Initially, I had been drawn to it for its irrepressible fanfare energy and its really catchy melodies. But I had no idea when I started transcribing it just how deep this song gets into complex harmonic detail. Now, before I can break this track down, allow me to explain how music and sound worked in those early Pokemon games, because it is an essential part to how these pieces of music would have been composed. As a handheld console from the very beginning of the century, the Game Boy Advance was a 32-bit console that relied on dual 8-bit sound. From what I've read, the Game Boy Advance's audio capabilities were actually pretty high. However, the game cartridges themselves were the things that had limited space for coding, and that included all of the music and sounds. To work within these limitations, it seems that the Pokemon games from the Game Boy Advance era allowed themselves 10 tracks for audio, with 6 tracks at a time being capable of playing a sound. For context, this is 6 tracks to allow for Pokemon cries, cursor sounds, other sound effects, and then all your melody and percussive elements. If a typical triad chord sounded, that's already taken up half of all the potential sound that can come out. And on top of already having to be economical with these compositions, composers then had to have careful consideration for the hierarchy of musical notes, so that they knew which ones could be dropped out in favor of sounds that have higher priority, like Pokémon cries and certain sound effects. And so to allow this juggling of sound, those 10 aforementioned tracks would have utilized MIDI programming. For those unaware, MIDI is probably one of the most common ways that sounds are triggered in games and electronic music. Even your typical keyboard or synthesizer uses it. And it's also used in other elements of coding that aren't to do with sound. And the way it works allows for a lot of flexibility and a lot of saving of space, but there is one significant drawback. So here I've made a very simple demonstration of what I mean. I've recorded it in 2 MIDI notes into Ableton Live, and if I put the playhead all the way to the beginning, all the way on the far left here, and I press play, we can hear both notes. However, if I put the playhead, say, halfway through this first one, despite the fact that it's been recorded, it will only play the second note. This is because when used for writing music, MIDI operates over time, and the beginning of that note is the all-important trigger for the sound. So you can see how MIDI is used to trigger sounds and notes that are stored in a very large bank contained within very dense coding in the game. So in addition to writing in all of the compositions as code, the composer would have to carefully consider which elements could drop out in favor of other sounds and for the music to still make sense. All of these limitations makes the richness that was still able to be achieved in the soundtrack of these games all the more impressive. Now to get back to Slateport City itself. After turning up on a beach, your character proceeds north and comes to a market on a large plaza surrounded by the sea. To one side, a shipyard and a harbour come into view, and to the north, the roads split in every direction. In terms of both location and music, Slateport City embodies that sense of upcoming adventure, and this is apparent in the opening few bars. The motif grabs your attention straight away with 16 more or less evenly spaced notes played in 4 groups, jumping between intervals with no note being played twice in a row. This might sound kind of abstract, but for someone who grew up in an old English town that had a lot of churches, there's something oddly familiar here. I didn't know if this is what Go Ichinose was going for, but to me it was kind of reminiscent of the Westminster Quarters. In other words, the Big Ben chime. Played out in a major key to mark and celebrate the arrival of new times, particularly famously New Year, Westminster Quarters kind of has that same energy of being excited for what's coming around the corner. Despite my kid thinking the same thing, I was initially unsure of this reference point because I didn't know how church bells worked, say, in Japan. In the south of Europe, they sound very, very different from here in the north of Europe, for example. But then just the other day, I found this. The Pokémon Ruby and Sapphire Super Music Collection. And not only is there a lyrical version of Slateport City, as it turns out, it begins every section, every kind of motif section, with the words ding dong. So it's definitely about bells, and that's definitely what's being invoked here. But in this main section of Slateport City, there's something else going on alongside the motif. Now, I didn't even notice until I started to transcribe the music. In amongst the melody, percussion, and any other MIDI sounds that might be playing, the remaining tracks are trying as best as they can to play these chords. D, A, B minor, A, G, D, E minor, A. Now, you may be hearing this and thinking, oh, this already sounds kind of familiar, and you may already know what I'm getting at. But what if we took that A chord, this A chord here, and instead of playing the E, we played the F sharp underneath? So we have an F sharp minor. And what if we take that E minor chord, and instead of playing this lower E here, we play this D here to make it a G chord? Well, then you get this. And if you know it at all, then you will know by now that this is Pachelbel's canon in D. You don't even need to have classical music knowledge to have some awareness of this piece of music. It's one of the most famous and referenced chord progressions of all time, showing up in Oasis's Don't Look Back in Anger, Green Day's Basket Case, Pet Shop Boys Go West, and All Together Now by The Farm. Not to mention its straight up sample in Coolio's See You When You Get There. More than that though, if you've seen a number of TV shows or films where there's a scene that requires a quick dose of elegance and class, chances are they've probably used this somewhere and you'll recognize it from there. Typically its main association these days is with weddings and classy celebrations, and this is something that was popularized by the wedding of Prince Charles and Diana. And so we have this really joyous motif that's associated with church bells and that's see in the new year, playing out over a chord progression that's typically associated with classiness and celebrations. And all of this culminates in something just irrepressibly joyful. And this is all happening in the first 4 bars only. As the piece moves into its first melody section, we take it down a gear in terms of these cultural reference points, but we don't do away with the idea entirely. There's a rhythmic figure, a march, that takes place throughout this track in various places, and it was instantly reminiscent of one of the most famous pieces of Pokémon music there is. It could be something that's born purely out of necessity, those MIDI limitations that we discussed earlier, but nonetheless, this strong rhythmic figure is definitely a calling card to me to those earlier Pokemon games. The first melody section is a lead line in D major which fleshes out the chords of an unusual but rather famous chord progression in the bass. For the most part, it implements in the key of D major this minor 2, 5, minor 3, minor 6, or E minor, A, F sharp minor, B. This is a rather unusual chord progression, and a quick Google search takes you to a Reddit post where someone explains that it's used to extend jazz turnarounds. But it does have one rather famous use. Never gonna give you up, never gonna let you down, never gonna run around and hurt you. Now this section here remains fairly diatonic with only a few deviations here and there. For example, in the 3rd bar we get this C natural, which is just a Mixolydian 7th, very common, and usually it would form, say, part of a D7 chord, fairly common chord, right? But here it's being paired with an F sharp and a C, giving us this tritone power chord. Then in the 7th bar we get something a little more interesting. The bass note goes to this B flat here, which in the context of D major would sound really out of place. But it works because in the lead they pair it very nicely with this F natural here. And again we get this power chord of B flat and F natural. These make up the minor 6th and the minor 3rd of D respectively, so nowhere near the D major scale. This B flat power chord is then followed with a C natural power chord, so C and G, and then A. Now this use of the minor 3rd, minor 6th and minor 7th is a very bold choice, but because Go Ichinose applies them with full commitment in both the bass and the lead, it kind of works in a really satisfying way. I'm going to tell you right now, this little section where it seems to go to D minor had me so perplexed for about 2 weeks. If you can already see what is actually happening here, then feel free to flex on me in the comments, but do be honest. Finally, the section rounds out nicely with this chromatic walk up from the flat 7th through the diminished diatonic 7th into the tonic chord, releasing all that tension. Well, I say that, but it does this one quick descent from A to E before pinging up into the first note of the next section. These kind of turnarounds that end up a note above or below the first note of the next section are actually used a lot throughout Slateport City. After returning to the main motif a bit, the track then goes into its second melody section, and this part really threw me through a loop for a while. It's clear that we've gone into a new key, but it wasn't immediately obvious to me what that new key was. Again, we get this heavy use of the B flat, the C natural and the F natural. Only this time around, Ichinose commits to this new key, with the lead staying very much diatonically with these notes, at least for the first phrase. But it's actually the chord progression in this section that really grabbed my attention. According to hooktheory.com, the chords that they have written for this section are impossibly fleshed out. B flat major 7, A minor 7, A flat major 7, and then G, and then into B flat major 7, C, and then A minor 7, D. So obviously with those 7 chords, that's 4 of the notes in the 6 potential notes being taken up. So there's a chance that some liberty has been taken, but it really does sound like these are fleshed out in some way in the original track from the game. Now, those first 4 chromatic chords are potent and flavorful, but it's the next 4 that really grabbed my attention. The motion itself felt really familiar. We were starting at 1 position in a scale, and then we're going up to the next position, down 2 positions, and then up 3 positions. And as far as I could tell, for the longest time, this was the diminished 6th, going into the diminished 7th, going into the 5th, and then going up to the root, and ending up on that D major. Following typical harmonic conventions that you get in music theory, this is not a particularly balanced chord progression, and the chord progression itself, 6, 7, 5, 1, was too rare. I was not finding examples of it in many places for it to feel so familiar. And then about a week ago, the answer came to me while I was washing up, and it was a real Occam's razor moment.
No.
Remember that B flat C A progression earlier that I said had me perplexed for about 2 weeks? If you are genuinely able to identify that as the Royal Road progression in F, then kudos to you. But the fact that I couldn't see what it was for literally 2 weeks really bothers me. I'm no slouch with music theory. I can follow any Rick Beato, Adam Neely, Charles Cornell video in real time. But this highlights that there are definitely some gaps in my practical comprehension of how music theory is used. I even suspected the Royal Road progression from the very beginning once I saw how we were going from one place, up a position, down 2 positions, and then up 3. For those unaware, in music theory, we try not to refer to scales in terms of how it makes us feel emotionally. We tend to refer to them as a point of light to a point of dark. So with Locrian being the darkest and Lydian being the lightest, and then everything else fitting in between. This is how it normally goes with the modes. And when I noticed this shift in tone, I felt those diminished notes going from B to B flat, from C sharp to C, from F sharp to F. And by comparison, the whole thing felt like it was losing energy, like it was diminished in some way, like it was darker in some way. In other words, the whole piece of music felt less bright to me in this section. And so I felt like we were going from a major key to a minor key, not changing to another major key altogether. I realise that I haven't explained what I mean when I say Royal Road progression. It's a name given to the chord progression of major 4th, major 5th, minor 3rd, minor 6th. Essentially, it is perhaps the most popular chord progression in Japanese music, being used in countless video games, anime soundtracks, and J-pop hits. It's even been used in a few other Pokémon tracks. Now, as I mentioned earlier, Ichinose sticks very much diatonically with the F major notes, at least for the first phrase. But then we start to see so many accidentals that it borders on being chromatic in places. So let's take this one phrase at a time. The first phrase is completely diatonic to F major, as we can see. F, E, F, G, C to D, and then C, B, E flat, C. But then we get this very prominent A flat. And despite the whole thing starting on this B flat here, we end up on B natural. From the perspective of F, the notes we've played so far are F, G, A flat, B flat, B and C. More or less, these make up the F blues scale, admittedly with the addition of the second. But you can see how very much in the blues scale. And it's kind of funny because in the last episode of DRC, we actually saw Jack Johnson go from a blues key into the same key but major. Here, Go Ichinose is doing the opposite, and they're both pulling it off with such conviction that it works. I feel that because the second phrase still includes the use of G, B flat and C, that the other notes that have been included that wouldn't normally be are accidentals, purely there to add flavour. What happens next now had me looking high and low for answers once again. For the first time in the track, we get a couple of phrases that don't include any unnatural notes or any notes that aren't sharps or flats. The first of these seems to be based around the first few notes and the seventh of C. So C, B, C, D, E, D, C, G. And then the second of these two phrases does the same thing but with A minor. And finally, the last phrase drops all pretense there, even B in a key, and does this chromatic run all the way up to B flat. And then drops down to D. So what key are we in now? C major? A minor? If you want to be a stickler about it, you could see it that way. But really, we never left F major. And the big clue as to what is going on here is right there in that second phrase. Pay attention to the chords underneath. That A flat from earlier, that one, is being played over this A major 7. And in this note, that B there is being played as an additional third to the G major chord. So then we get this progression of the longer third phrase playing C major. Well, that leads into a C major chord underneath. And that phrase in A minor plays over, you guessed it, A minor. So we haven't actually changed key at all. This lead melody that we're playing is only aping these chords underneath, regardless of whether the notes in those chords are fully diatonic or not. To be honest, it's the kind of nonsense that I would have tried when I first learned to play music, only to realise how messy it usually sounds. But Go Ichinose pulls it off so organically, and from a musician's perspective, there's something really playful about this. And finally, we reach our last chord of D major, which is arguably the biggest anomaly of this entire section. You see, the final chord in the Royal Road is the 6th, a chord which typically contains itself, the tonic, and the third. In a major key, the 6th chord should be a minor chord. And so where we have the notes F, A and C and the tonic chord of F, we should be expecting two of those notes, F and A, to appear alongside the D as part of D minor. It's this incorporation of the tonic that allows the Royal Road's progression to end in a way that feels nearly but not fully resolved. So throwing in this F sharp here as part of the D major triad in something that's otherwise been F major, really adds a lot of dissonance. There is an additional function to its inclusion here, but I'll come to that in a bit. First, let's look at this final phrase. It starts out on this F sharp here, which complements the D major chord underneath, and then dips down into the F natural, which is the minor third of D, but remember the root note of the scale that we're supposedly in, before doing this chromatic run up to B flat, before dropping down to the root note of D. And that's it. After that, we return to the motif and we just play out the same motif that we've been playing at the very beginning for the last 4 bars and then completing the loop, right? Right? Well, no. Remember how I said there was a function to that D major chord with that F sharp in the last section? And remember how much earlier in the video I said that each section seems to end one note above or one note below the beginning note of the next phrase, creating a kind of turnaround? Well, with literally seconds to go before the whole thing sort of finishes and then comes around to the beginning of the loop, Go Ichinose pulls one final new key change on us. That D major, which should have sounded so out of place in the Royal Road progression played in F, serves as the perfect Mixolydian 7th, leading into the motif again, but played now in the key of E major. With the amount of compositional trickery that he put into those lead melodies and the range of chord progressions and those cultural reference points, Go Ichinose could easily have called it a day right there and then. But in the words of Mark Knopfler, he makes it fast with one more thing. I will tell you again, that when I started to look at the sheet music and how it was played and everything, I had no idea just how rich this one piece of music is. I'm surprised that no one else has really talked about this on YouTube to this extent. And I certainly never realized what a puzzle it would end up being, something that was so satisfying to work out. At the beginning, I thought of this track as something just really catchy and irrepressibly upbeat, and I would have given it maybe a very strong 7 out of 10, possibly an 8. But for the amount that it's made me think and really exercise myself as a music theorist, I've had to really reconsider it. And now it really is a very, very, very strong 9, with 10 generally being something that I only assign to stuff that makes me feel something deeply. This certainly did make me think deeply, and I know one thing for certain. The next time I get to Slateport City in Pokemon Ruby, Sapphire, Emerald, I'm not going to be bored for a good while longer.